Okay, everybody. So let's jump into the solar news for the week to start out, and then we'll talk a little bit about legislation. And I guess from our discussion before we started recording, we'll touch a little bit on some battery technologies and the like. So this week, the main items in solar news, Microsoft and Qcells announced a deal where they're going to be constructing about 2.5 gigawatts of power for Microsoft. I'm not quite sure if this is a power purchase agreement or if Microsoft's going to own these systems, but Qcells, which is a German manufacturer of solar panels, is actually going to do the engineering, the procurement, and the construction of these. So they're going to manage the whole thing. Give you a sense, 2.5 gigawatts is the equivalent power, enough to power about 2 million homes. And Microsoft has announced that they're wanting not only to get to carbon neutral, but to get to carbon negative by 2030. So this is part of that procurement process. And NextEra Energy has announced that they have installed in the last year about 5 gigawatts of solar nationwide, investing about $19 billion into this project. And I hadn't realized that NextEra Energy is the largest developer of renewable energy in the United States, and they are the parent company of Florida Power and Light, which surprised me a little bit too, because living in Florida at one point, never really thought of Florida Power and Light as a progressive company. They did see earning income increase of about 14% over 2021. So the solar is obviously good for the bottom line. And significantly, they're planning on installing over the next 4 years somewhere between 32 and 42 gigawatts of solar in the US. So they're, going great guns, which is interesting. Seeing how much solar is in the pipeline, the big issue here is going to be primarily interconnection, how they're going to be able to interconnect in with the grid. I guess that gives NextEra Energy, at least in Florida, a head up on getting connected, since Florida Power and Light would be the one that they have to make those arrangements with. So it just came to mind when I was seeing this, because I just listened yesterday to a podcast on nuclear energy and all the hype around nuclear and how it's going to be huge, and again, all these things, and it doesn't ring a chord with me. Anyway, the Department of Energy just released a report that outlined 3 ways that Puerto Rico can get to 100% renewable by 2050. And this is important because Puerto Rico, well, first off, they've had some issues, mostly weather related, but also old infrastructure. So they've had some hurricane related issues where the grid was devastated. So they passed a law, it's called Act 17, where they're wanting to get to 100% renewable by 2050. They have some interim goals, 40% by 2025, 60% by 2040. So what the Department of Energy did is they put together this report and showed that it is indeed feasible to get there with a very resilient grid, primarily relying on solar and battery storage. And one of the new high-tech things in the world of solar was they're experimenting with ways of keeping birds off of your solar arrays. And you wouldn't think that's a huge problem, but in coastal areas especially, or buildings where birds tend to hang out or roost, it can be significant. In fact, some of the studies have shown that as much as 50% of the panels production can be lost because of the birds themselves, but the droppings they leave on the panels. There's the cost of cleaning these panels that can be significant. They do cause damage to the panels. Some of these birds are large and peck at things and cause all sorts of problems. And if you've got a flat roof with a whole bunch of birds up there nesting under the array, whatever, droppings, they can leave the carcasses, the feathers, the nesting material will block the drains on a flat roof, can cause some significant leaks in the building. Now the birds themselves are attracted to these arrays because they're warm, they give off the heat, and they also provide a nice nesting area under the array, especially in a ballasted system where you're getting a lot of shelter there. So that was most of the news from the solar industry for this week. Anybody have anything to add to that, or any comments about some of it? It's fairly slow legislatively and product-wise, but a couple of interesting things. So any comments there? Okay, if not, you can always jump in and interrupt me if that's the case, but let's jump into the discussion topic that I pulled out, largely because, did somebody have? Oh, okay, never mind. I'll get out from behind there. Oops, I'm getting an echo here. I'm gonna turn off, let's see, Eugene, could you mute yours? Because I think I'm getting the echo from you there. Okay, so legislative activity that happened in 2022 that affects solar. There's a new report that just came out, and this report is generated by the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. You can get the summary if you just Google it. You'll find it there. Gives some of that, but I'll recap what's in this report. If you want to spend $1,000 or whatever, you can get the entire report. It just came out this week. So basically in 2022, out of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, 46 of those states enacted laws or legislation that affects solar. The 4 that didn't, looks like Alaska, Louisiana, and now that looks Nebraska and Kansas in the middle there. So pretty much everybody else was dealing with legislation. If I remember right, there were as many as like 285 laws that went into effect last year focused on solar. So most of these changes, there's definitely a trend in all of this. The states are attacking net metering laws. Essentially, the utilities have come in lobbying. They're saying, we don't like the idea of paying retail for excess energy coming from the grid or coming from the arrays to the grid. So the legislatures are accommodating that by massively changing net metering laws. The granddaddy of all of that was in California, where net metering 3.0 kicked in last year, where they essentially cut the amount of money that the utility pays for excess power to about a quarter of what it had been prior. So that is a trend, and I'll get into more specifics on that here in a minute. They are beginning to expand community solar access. So there are a lot of states that are looking towards expanding that opportunity. Now, community solar, just as a reminder, is where if you don't put it on your own home, but you buy in and own a portion of a larger array. So for example, instead of putting small arrays on 20 homes in a neighborhood, you could each buy 1/20th of a large array, and all you need is the utility to then allocate the production of that array to your home. And so a lot of these states are beginning to mandate that happen. In the states that do have community solar legislation in place, community solar is a dominant form of residential solar. It just makes more sense. You get all the economies of scale of a large installation without people having to do the penetrations on the roof and the like. Gives better access for apartments and a lot of advantages there.
Jay,
and, yeah, yep.
How much is that going to cost relative to basically doing an install?
Oh, it's cheaper. If
like
you
look, by what fractions, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think we're talking utility scale, but if you look at the averages of the cost, a residential is still averaging $3.325 a kilowatt, whereas larger commercial systems are in the more like the $2 stage. So installing one of those, relatively modest sized community solar, you could do for about 2/3 the cost of doing individual systems. if they get very large, like utility scale, those are already down to about $1 a watt. So if we're seeing very large community solar utility scale, it could be 1/3 of the cost of doing individual systems.
Okay.
Yep. And the other thing that's really of the main ones is residential fixed charges. The utilities are saying we don't want to see people getting their electricity for free. At a minimum, we want to be able to bill them, whether it's access charges or fixed monthly charges, however they word it. They don't want people going down to net zero. Of course, the argument from the utility is that there is a cost to them of providing infrastructure to the building. They want to recover that cost. The counter argument is if the solar array is generating power, when the utility needs it, which is fairly common with solar, because it's going to be mid-afternoon on hot days, then the utility is already realizing a profit, and by hooking up to that, they're benefiting. So anyway, that's going to be a losing argument because we don't have all the lobbyists in the various states. So if we look at drill down a little bit deeper on this, what we're beginning to see, as I mentioned, is the states are moving away from traditional net metering. I think the days of the meter running backwards, the meter running forwards, and you only pay the net amount, those are gone or disappearing. The only state that was bucking that trend was the state of Florida, where the governor vetoed a bill that would have done that. I think that governor is thinking about becoming president, and that's probably the motivation there. But I think that Florida will certainly come along at some point along this trend. Net billing is becoming the dominant structure here. So the term net billing, as opposed to net metering, is really when they're talking about they're no longer going to pay you retail, run the meter backwards, which was the net metering concept. They're going to pay you avoided costs. So they're saying essentially to the owner of a PV system, you are just another energy provider as far as we're concerned. And whatever we pay as wholesale to these energy providers, that's what we're going to pay to you. Now, some of these state legislators have said, all right, that's fine, but you ought to give them a little bit of a bump. So you're seeing sometimes avoided cost plus 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, but sometimes it's just simply avoided cost. If I had to buy it from another supplier, how much would I pay? That's what I'm going to give you as far as net metering. So essentially there, you're buying from the utility wholesale or retail, and you're selling it back to them wholesale. That's logical from a utility standpoint, at least to my way of thinking. But as far as a customer's perspective, then it really encourages the adoption of batteries into the system, because then you can get into self-consumption. Why should I sell it at wholesale and then buy back at retail when I can simply just store what I've generated and use it? So that's now you're going to see a lot more battery storage there. States are beginning to incorporate, they call it LMI, it's low and moderate income specific provisions. So there's a lot of this where solar, as far as social engineering, there's a concern that solar has been a bit elitist. Only the people who can afford to pay for it can get it. So how do we begin to incorporate solar into low and moderate income housing and programs of that nature? There's, of course, focus on grid access fees and minimum bills. We're seeing a lot of that. So basically they're coming in and saying, okay, if you're hooked up to the grid, you're going to pay a base fee, a grid access fee, and we're only going to be paying you wholesale for what you pump back. Now, some utilities will allow you to then, at wholesale, whittle away at that base fee. Others, that's not going to be an option. The states that are considering community solar, the 5 that considered it in 2022, these aren't completed necessarily, but they're in the process, are Arizona, Mississippi, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So that's going to be a big deal in those states if they do adopt community solar in any wide or accessible way. Growing use of time varying. Basically, what we're talking about is not only compensation rates, but also billing rates, so time of use. But now they're taking time of use and saying, okay, since power is more valuable to us at different times during peak load, we'll pay you a little bit more for that power if you're feeding it back to us at that time of day. So we're seeing a growing complexity in the way net metering systems are set up, where, you know, how much you're paying for your power is going to vary. And we've seen for a while some states or some utilities put in low, moderate, and high demand periods. So they basically break the day into 3. That's beginning to change, where now it's almost to a minute-by-minute basis, certainly to an hour-by-hour basis, where the pricing changes hourly. But eventually they're going to want to get to real time. That's where the movement is. So you'll never know. I mean, you're going to have some sort of meter or monitor to let you know what is the electric rate at this second, at this moment. That's gonna change a lot of things. So it's basically going to be a very fluid rate schedule. Yeah, a lot of states are looking at that. I listed them all there, all the way from Alaska down to Wyoming. Encouraging generation with battery storage. That seems to be, of course, the big discussion point. We've had those discussions here, where batteries plus storage, batteries plus solar, are going to be the next big thing. Largely time of use is driving that. Changes in net meter is going to drive that. The unreliability of the grid is going to drive that. So we're already seeing where 50% or so of all of the residential systems out there are incorporating battery storage. Now we're going to start seeing this in the commercial end. We're going to see it, you know, just expand and expand. So if you're designing systems, if you're not already putting the storage in, you should certainly design them to anticipate storage coming in. Another thing the states are doing is tying the building of solar arrays to labor rates. Many of these systems many of these legislative initiatives now require prevailing wage. And of course, that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act as well, where if you're qualifying for these benefit programs, you must pay prevailing wage, which is essentially union wage, whether it's a union or not. That's going to be part of it. Again, socially engineering how these things get built. And then, as I mentioned, the distributed generation programs are increasingly becoming more and more complex. You know, as we see the legislation start to understand that the marketplace is changing, very dynamic. In fact, many of these legislative initiatives now state that they will have periodic reviews of the solar policies, because doing it in big chunks is just too unwieldy. This is something that's really changing the infrastructure of our nation. And, you know, rightly so, they want to be on top of that. To give you a sense of where these are falling from a just statistical perspective, of the actions that took place last year, the distributed generation compensation rules, that was the vast majority of them, basically gutting net metering, taking it away from retail when you feed it back to some sort of cost plus. Then you get into community solar initiatives. That's the second place there. Then residential fixed charges, you know, minimum bills, access fees, that's the next one. The demand or solar charges, that again is the flexible billing that we just touched on. There are a number of them that didn't take action, but they're doing studies. That's always something when people don't agree that they love to do, is let's go out there and see just how much should the price be. What is the value of this distributed energy to the utilities, Then another area of concern is third-party ownership of solar. That is really focused primarily on solar leasing and power purchase agreements. Not every state allows those to take place. So the states that are currently not allowing them are beginning to consider that third parties can own these systems and either lease them to the person or company, or simply sell the power. And then there are utility-led rooftop PV programs. Now, this is kind of interesting and just in its infancy, but the utilities are beginning to say, you know what, we can get into the solar business as well. Why don't we start owning these systems, essentially doing solar leasing on residents and commercial properties? So the utilities would own the system, probably subcontract out the installation, and then sell the power back or sell the equipment, depending on how they want to structure that. So they're beginning to get legislation in place there. From a solar installer standpoint, it seems a little bit unfair that you would say that the utility, who I have to negotiate with to get interconnected, is now going to become my chief competitor. We're already seeing that in the car charging world, where the utilities are wanting to get into the world of car charging. So now we're beginning to see this in the rooftop solar, even at the residential level. So that's the legislation that was taking place last year. Anybody have any questions on that?
So is jobs going to become obsolete as far as solar installers, Jay?
Oh, no. I mean, first off, it's just another competitor. Utilities are pretty bad at doing what they do, so you can probably outcompete them, but it's something else that to consider, or you become a subcontractor with the utility. But it's just another group entering the marketplace, but I don't think it's gonna, if you're a good installer, there's always work. So
if one has a fraction of a community solar and then the grid needs inputs from outside, and so is the cost you pay as a consumer from that as a homeowner, part of that consortium, are you paying a fixed rate from the solar as long as the solar output reaches you as adequate, or are you paying an averaged rate from all the other inputs?
Let's see. I think basically the way I understand community solar, it can be structured two different ways. It can be structured like you simply own the number of panels, just as if you had it on your home, and whatever it produces, you get credit for that production against your bill, just as if it were on your home. If you need more power, then of course you're going to pay whatever the cost of that power is, but you should get allocation based on the retail rate. Now, if they move that to wholesale, well, then that guts community solar. I mean, what's the point? Now you're just getting wholesale, and if you put it on your home, you're effectively getting retail. But if you put it on in a community solar, you're getting wholesale. That doesn't work. The other option with a community solar would be that you are guaranteed a certain amount of power output from that. So one, you own the equipment, and the other, you basically are getting energy from it. So all of these things can be structured however you want to structure them. And I'm sure that's in the legislation, giving the different options. But think of it effectively as, instead of putting it on your roof, now you're just putting it into a big grid, and all the other things should apply the same as if it were on your roof. Did that answer your question there, Jay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions? I know we were touching.
Jay,
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead, Eugene.
Jay,
Uh-huh.
does anyone else have AEP as their grid provider?
I do down here in Marietta, but I'm sure somebody else does, probably on the call.
Well, Jay, I guess you know then that the bill is it's got the partials of the supply charge and the delivery charge. The delivery charge is made up of transmission and distribution separately. And the delivery, and as a solar, rooftop solar grid tie, which I have, I only get paid back for the supply charge, which is about a third of the total per kilowatt hour usage billing. Is that typical around the country? Or, I mean, it seems like in that case, they're getting paid by me, basically. It's just the generation that they're reimbursing me, you know.
Yeah. Now, isn't the supply and transmission charge based on the kilowatt hours that you consume?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah, so if you're not consuming power, then you're basically getting a reduction. So you're just saying that when I over generate, I'm only getting a small portion, not the total portion, which seems kind of tacky of them, because they don't have those other charges incurred if they're not transmitting. I could see them arguing distribution, because that power still needs to go through their different distribution infrastructure. But the transmission charges is usually the part of it that goes from a power plant to their distribution network. So if you had a large coal burning power plant, there's the high power lines that go from there to the substations in your neighborhood. That part's eliminated, when you're generating it directly into the distribution system. So it should,
I'll have to double check that.
well, I know that they're
Yeah.
not giving you credit for it. I'm just saying logically they should, but they're going to get away with whatever they can get away with. So what that's going to do is steer you towards batteries. I mean, why would you feed it back and get a third of what you should get when you can self-consume? And if you self-consume, you've eliminated the transmission and the distribution and the generation charges, because it's all based on how many kilowatt hours you're buying from them. So if you reduce the amount you're buying by using batteries, you've saved a lot more money than you sell it back to them. Does that make any sense in that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Could I bring up what I brought up a couple weeks ago about the 120% cap for residential solar delivered back? Do you know how they calculate that? Because on my bill, it splits it out into power delivered from AEP to me and power received from me to AEP. And if you take that ratio, in my case, I am exporting to them 180%, and I'm receiving from them, 100%. So I'm exporting way more than I'm pulling from the grid on a monthly basis, a yearly basis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my understanding again, and I might be wrong. This is an Ohio law that you're talking about. I don't think the 120% rule has anything to do with how much you're sending back versus how much you're pulling from them. It basically says your array cannot be sized greater than 125% or 120% of your consumption requirements. So if you've done an analysis of your consumption, and let's say you take in 1,000 kilowatt hours per month, then you cannot set up an array that generates more than 1,200 kilowatt hours per month. Now, as you start looking at your individual bills, depending on how things fall, that's going to be confusing, and I don't know how you get back to that original design thing.
I did that calculation. I calculated my consumption versus how much I export back to the grid, and that's about 105%.
Yeah. So you should be fine. I've never heard of anybody getting dinged about this. You know, I think once you've got approval, and that should take place during the commissioning phase, then they're going to say, yes, you've designed this so you're not generating more than 120%. And that's probably the last time they're going to look at it.
Okay.
That'd be my guess.
So.
All right. Devin, you had a question there?
Yeah, actually I have two questions. I'm not sure how the tariff works in the United States compared to us here in Trinidad. But for commercial customers, commercial grid tie system, would the same many proposed alterations would apply to them same? Or in other words, if they didn't wholesale for commercial, would they be at the same rate as a residential or something different?
Yeah, I think the commercial is often treated separately than residential. They look at those as two separate things. So that's going to be dependent upon the specific legislation. You know, our commercial typically has a different rate structure anyway. So how much you're going to be compensated is going to be different as well. And of course, all of the incentive programs are treated differently for commercial systems versus residential. So I think we're really looking at two different things.
Okay. In Trinidad, right, we have something called maximum demand charge, which is basically if you're running a factory or a business or something and you have a peak load at a particular time in the day, they bill you for that, but they don't bill you just for 5 minutes. They give you an hour. And so whether you use it or not, you're still going to be billed for that maximum demand.
Right.
Does the same thing applies across there, or is it different?
Yeah, and this is really not a residential situation because they don't apply demand charges, but at the commercial or industrial level, utilities typically have demand charges, which would be similar to your maximum demand. And what they do is they say, all right, for a 15-minute segment of time over the course of the month, whatever the highest level of demand that you have, we will now bill you, and there's a factor that they put in based on that highest usage. Their argument is we had to provide the infrastructure, even though it's only for 15 minutes, we had to provide that to you to meet that maximum demand. And so we're going to bill it, and it can be really, really significant. It can double or triple your electric bill if you have a high demand for a very short period of time, which tends to then say, all right, well, why don't we start using batteries, incorporate them into the system to run those high load demands to even out our monthly load demand. So if I have an hour where a big motor is running, for example, that really kicks up my demand for an hour just once a month or once a week, why don't I use batteries to power that motor and then spend the rest of the month recharging those batteries? So you can pay for the battery system that way by leveling your load demand, which significantly reduces your bill from the utility. And this raises a big issue with electric vehicle charging stations, because as we talked about a few weeks ago, if let's say I run a gas station and my electric bill runs, you know, $2,000 a month, and it has sort of a level demand, you know, fairly level, then I put a charging station in, and all of a sudden 600 amps, you know, goes for 2 hours, and that's thrown my demand charges through the roof, and now my bill is $6,000 instead of $2,000 just to charge one vehicle one time a month. So, you know, that doesn't make any sense. You know, from a billing standpoint, the utility certainly has their argument, but I think these demand charges have to change, or the way we're going to be charging electric vehicles has to change, because it's not going to make financial sense to install those. So I talked to somebody who does this, who installs them in gas stations, and I said, well, how do you solve that problem? And he said, we tell the owner, your electric bill's going through the roof. That's
I have a similar problem in Trinidad, where we installing a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger by a automotive dealer. He's bringing out some Audi electric vehicles, but the requirements in order for him to resell those vehicles in Trinidad, Audi tell him he needs to install a DC fast charger at that point. So we had a meeting last week with the electrical contractor, and basically the same things they're talking about with the demand. We're going to have that problem to sort out.
Yeah. Well, I heard that Tesla was dealing with this for some of their banks of charging stations by simply bringing in very large batteries, you know, like a semi-trailer battery, and charging the vehicles from that battery, and then swapping out the battery, taking it to a solar array or a wind farm or something like that, recharging it. So they're taking one big battery, charging a lot of little batteries, and avoiding the grid altogether in that regard. That seems like a very cumbersome way of dealing with things, but
yeah, Jay, I actually saw this last time I was in LA in Santa Monica. They had an empty lot, a 18-wheel flatbed trailer with a massive ass battery on it, and then a few 150 kilowatt chargers put together, and they would drop it on site and then discharge as needed and then take it away.
Yeah. Well, are you seeing, I know, Tony, you're in the world of EV charging, and we always seem to get back there because that's the big thing. How are you dealing with demand charges? I mean, how are we going to deal with demand? It seems like the utilities who want to get into this market are not playing fair, because they say we're going to apply one set of rules to you guys, but those rules don't apply to us when it comes to billing. So how are we going to deal with that?
Right. So I'll answer it in kind of two parts. The first is what we identified a few years ago. You know, one of the advantages of having an electric vehicle is you shouldn't have to regularly go somewhere else for your electrons specifically, right? For your energy, for your transportation. Between your house and your destination that you're going to go to anyway, if you have enough level 2 or low level 3, what we found was that people really want, both for fleet operators and just like normal folks, they want something between 10, we'll call it 10 and 30 kilowatt chargers, just kind of for the normal destination use. Now, obviously you've got, when you're doing cross-country trips and stuff, you want to push a lot more, so you're not hanging around for 2, 3, 4, 6 hours somewhere. For those situations, what we're seeing, like what we can do, but then what we've also seen other folks kind of coming to rallying around is the incorporation of a battery into that, so that you're at no point are you discharging at a supercharging rate, but you are drip recharging, refilling that lithium ion battery, and then you are discharging at a supercharging rate. So as an example, there's a company called FreeWire. I believe they have 770 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery attached as part of their 150 kilowatt charger. You can refill that battery with either a 3-phase grid connection, a 240 grid connection, or there's even a connector to an existing like CCS charging cable. So existing level 2 site, plug it in, fill up the battery, drip, refill it, and then you have the capability of discharging it at supercharging rates. That's just like what we're seeing is like real people trying to figure out this problem.
That would assume that charging station is not being used one after another, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, Devin?
No, I was just going to ask the question because it is something we're trying to figure out what is the best way to. We've seen more and more DC fast chargers coming in the country, and that demand is something to worry about. Besides that, sometimes a client don't have a three-phase 400 or 480 volt supply, they might be running 230 to 40, and then
Yep.
they have to request that from the utility to get an additional supply or change the supply. And that's a big cost by itself.
Sure it
Utility
is.
comes in, they want to see if the existing capacity on the transformers there before. If it's not there, they have to change out those transformers. There's a whole process. So that is one cost on infrastructure change by itself. Now, you have to study what is the bill like. So I'll listen to what it's saying about the battery. It makes sense. I was just wondering the cost of putting on a 200 kilowatt lithium ion battery bank, economically wise, just paying the utility bill and the demand charges, do you see some savings from it otherwise?
It'll depend on where your utility rate and what peak demand charges are in your area, to kind of accurately answer that question. The short answer is that a lot of it depends on usage, but over the long term or long-ish term, the math pencils. Now that's not, again, that like our like first, yeah, you can stack our system in 25 kilowatt modules to get up to 150, but
Right.
from our perspective, let's keep as much at the 25 or 50 level as possible.
So a 50 kilowatt, 60 kilowatt will be an ideal range.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, it's like let's for both folks who want to electrify their vehicle fleet. They wanted something when we did customer discovery. They wanted something 3 or 4 times faster than a level 2 charger,
Yes.
but they really weren't willing to pay for anything above 50 kilowatts, right? So like that's the reality, is like they weren't willing to pay for anything above 50, but they wanted something in the 20 to 25 kilowatt range. So what we decided on was, rather than like split the difference or pick a random number, that we were going to do building blocks of that base 25 and scale up if you wanted to, but at an initial kind of level, keep it at that 25.
Yeah, it makes sense. I have to talk to you again at this when we finish.
Okay, well, it sounds to me, what I'm getting out of that, Tony, is that basically we're going to have to, as a society, come to some understanding with electric vehicles. You either charge them slowly at your home and office, or if you're going to rely on fast charging, it's going to cost you a significant premium to recharge at a fast rate. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's directionally correct. I think, like any kind of disruptive technology, there'll need to be kind of a little bit of a change in behavior. I think ultimately it'll be for the better. I think if you actually factor in the times that you'll need, 150 to 300 kilowatt super mega cool guy ultra charger, it's like a handful of times a year for most people. I think everything else should be able to be covered by the house or their office, and that, anywhere between that 25 kilowatt to 7, kilowatt range. As like a real example, my Tesla right now in my garage is on a 110. Now, we're planning to upgrade that to the 240, obviously, but it's been able to, it still charges. It's not like it doesn't require some kind of crazy magic. And when you look at the battery pack size, right, depending on your vehicle, what's standard is typically between 70 and 80 kilowatt hour battery pack for your electric vehicle. If you look at that graph that I shot you about, charging rates, and how, like, really, even if you go supercharging, you're only doing it for a portion. Typically that like 20 to 80 range is pretty fast, that initial bump, and then it drops off pretty rapidly. So from our perspective, keep it steady Eddie, keep it a hell of a lot less expensive on the 25 side, and roll from there.
Okay. Yeah, it just occurred to me as we were discussing this that, the rationale for demand charges, which is what's driving a lot of this cost element, is that they have to pay for the infrastructure required to deliver those high levels of power to you. But as Devin pointed out, you want to install that, they're going to charge you for installing the infrastructure that's required to drive that to you. So it's like you got to pay for it up front, and then you got to keep paying for it over and over. I think we need to get some lobbyists out there and start messing with the whole concept of demand charges, where, if we're going to truly electrify the vehicle fleet, that's something that's got to be addressed.
And in my conversations with electricians, it's not as bleak maybe all over the country as it is in some parts. So like for example, I've talked to some electricians who are putting in EVSE, and they've said that if the utility is, semi-conscious of what's happening in the world, they will kind of spec out the infrastructure for that charging station to avoid peak demand charges. They'll optimize it for what we think is the daily, weekly, monthly average of that site to avoid some of those crazy spikes in peak demand charges. The flip side of that is the cost of the time in many cases of that project. I mean, in California, one of the other reasons that Tesla did that in Santa Monica is because, and then they've done it in other places, is because they were looking at a 12 to 18 month delay from the time they said, I'd like to charge. They're like, well, let's go now, until the time you can charge an electric vehicle. By the time you get through permitting and construction and all this other nonsense, you're looking at 12 to 18 months of delay. So it's like, pick your poison, right? You might be able to avoid your peak demand charges, but then you might have to wait 12 to 18 months to actually put this stuff in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big issue, and that gets into the whole interconnection problems that we have. And I know there's been a lot of discussion at the national level trying to deal with that. But I think some of not all of it, but some of it gets to the fact that it is the utilities themselves that are trying, they have an economic incentive to delay interconnection of their competitors. And so until we get beyond that, where we take the control of that interconnection away from those people who have an economic incentive not to let it happen, we're going to have problems. I don't know how you solve that. When
I don't mean to be pessimistic.
It would really be like giving Walmart the ability to issue building permits for retailers in a community. And you got to go through Walmart before you can open up a store that wants to compete with Walmart,
Yeah, I think the only way that's going to happen is like the industry itself, us little guys on the bottom of the totem pole, will end up just sidestepping that. Because I don't think waiting for Superman is going to be the right answer, because to your point, it is illogical for utilities to make that faster from their own self-interest. So don't rely on that. And I think if you're expecting a policy change from someone who is in office for 2 years, I can promise you on the list of 10 things to accomplish is not, rather exciting regulation of utility interconnection. So it's not going to happen. Not going to be solved on the policy side. It's not going to be solved by the entrenched interest. So the only way to get around that is, startups and other technology companies and early adopters sidestepping that, right? I think that's the only way we're going to be able to do this. And we're going to do it. We're going to do it, to be very clear. Yeah. It's going to happen. It's just like, that's what's going to happen.
We'll put all our faith in you guys, Tony, because no, I think you're very, very much the case. And even if you can convince the legislature, the public utility commissions are very cozy with the entrenched utility structure. So they're the ones who are setting these rules, and we see in California, for example, a real sort of schizophrenic perspective there. The legislature is let's go renewable, and the utility commission is throwing every barrier they can think of in the face of going renewable. So we have some challenges, but you can't change the world without somebody getting a little bit annoyed. So I suspect that's what we're doing. We're changing everything. So, all right, well, we're coming up close here. Anybody else have anything to add in the last 2 or 3 minutes here?
Jay, Bruce, have you ever considered doing any other trainings beside installer?
Yeah.
Like sales or lobbying?
Oh, sales and lobbying. Actually, we're in the process of developing, we've got a lawyer who is going to develop a short course on the legal ramifications associated with solar. As far as permitting, liabilities, contract issues, things like that, and market it to other attorneys, but also to the general public. So that's one area that we're branching into. I don't know, there aren't enough hours in the day. We're also thinking about modifying some of our existing curriculum into Spanish. So that's something to to look towards, but that's a big project as well. So don't give me anything else to do, Bruce.
Jay, Jay,
Yeah.
could you hold any classes on like, say, like setting up inverters?
Oh, you mean like programming the inverters
Yeah.
themselves, commissioning? Yeah.
Yeah,
Problem with that is, of course, each unit has its own little world. It's one reason why people use the same product over and over. They get comfortable with something, and now the first time it takes you 4 hours, and the second time it takes you 45 minutes. So it would
but I
be
mean,
it would be easy in residential because the primary drivers there are going to be Enphase and Solar Edge.
right.
And I guess we could do something like that. But when you get into commercial, now the field expands and the
No,
situation.
I understand that, but say from the standpoint of being a newbie and whatnot, I've got Enphase, but not a string inverter. So it's kind of like I'd either have to buy my own string inverter and just play with it.
Uh-huh.
But it's when
Yeah.
you're setting up a string inverter, basically you have done it and you know what needs to be done versus, okay, I get one and then I just start playing with it.
Yeah, that's something to consider. I was just trying to think if it's something that could be done online. And another thing I can see too is, these things change, especially. So you might get the class all set up and this is the way you do an Enphase, and then Enphase decides they've now changed their whole menu system and they've changed their process. So it would really take a lot of care and feeding to make it good.
Okay.
All right, so hopefully, there's a lot of good product specific training out there. You can go through the Solar Edge Academy, you can go through the Enphase training. They've got some stuff. I guess that's where I'd kind of direct you to.
Right. Sounds good.
Because you can get certification from both Enphase and Solar Edge directly from them. And if the training is not up to date, then it's all on them.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Okay, well, let's call it a day, and we'll see you all next time. All right. Thanks.
Have a good week.
Take care.